I can't tell you the first thing about how to read or write music, and I couldn't play you a note to save my life. But I have always loved the symphony, and I am particularly affectionate for the strings. And so I love when Javier Chaparro, who's our first violinist, is here at Riverbend. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to hear him play, but he makes incredible sounds with his violin. But he actually has an amazing story. Javier grew up in Lima, Peru. He was born into a family of musicians. His father was a French horn player. His mother was a concert pianist. He was actually the third generation of musicians. He had two older brothers who had both kind of claimed violin, so the hope was that he would pick up piano, which he started playing at the age of 3. But by 6, he had zeroed in on violin. He was actually playing as a child, as a soloist with the National Symphony in Peru. But he got this incredible opportunity. He was offered a position at the Opera Orchestra in Mexico City, and so he moved by himself at the age of 15. He played with the National Symphony in Mexico City, and he'll tell you it was really hard to be by himself. It was hard to leave his family. It was hard to be on his own. It was hard work. But he put the earnings he made and invested them in acquiring instruments. Y'all may not know this, but violins are actually really expensive. And so he'd make money and earn money, and he'd acquire a violin. And so he had a few. He had the one that he'd started playing on, which was a little violin, he says, with a big sound. It was Italian from the early 1800s. And he had another violin that was French that he'd inherited from his uncle. But the most prized instrument he had, his absolute favorite, the one that he identified his career with, was his Bellini. No, not the peach cocktail. That's what I thought too. Bellini was actually the most celebrated and most coveted contemporary violin maker in the world. At the time of Bellini's death in 2015, there was a 15-year waiting list for one of his violins. But Javier had one. Eventually, he moved to Austin, and we got to enjoy him at the Austin Symphony. And eventually, he became the concert master with the Brazos Valley Symphony Orchestra. And we're lucky enough to call him our first violinist. So it was here in Central Texas where he was living when, on September 4th, 2011, the most devastating wildfire in state history ripped through Bastrop County. It devastated over 1,600 homes, including Javier's. He lost that day everything he owned: his record studio, his beautiful guitars, and all his violins. Now, Javier will tell you that he didn't even consider quitting. He said, "I lost my voice. My instrument was the way I communicated, and I lost my voice." But quitting wasn't an option for Javier. This was his contribution. This was his thing to do. To use Pastor Dave's words from last week, he could not do it. So it wasn't a question of quitting, it was just a question of finding a new voice. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I have a 12-year-old little daughter named Camden who is a violin player as well. Well, as starting out 12-year-olds might be. And I told you I have a great affection for the strings, so the day she came to me and said, "I want to learn the violin," I was delighted. I didn't know how to do that. That sounded great. So we got her lessons. And for about a year and a half, she took violin about once a week. And she would play and she would practice in her room, and she learned all the sort of basic starter songs like Twinkle, Twinkle and Silent Night. But then this past school year, she had her first opportunity to participate in orchestra, something that's offered at the middle school level. And a couple months into the school year, she came to me one day and she said, "Mom, orchestra is so cool. Because I can play violin on my own, and I can learn my instrument, and I can practice in my room, and I can figure out a new song. But orchestra, there's something about orchestra, a sound that we make when we all get together. There's an energy to that. There's a sound in that I can't do on my own." And while I've never played an instrument, and I've certainly never participated in orchestra, I knew exactly what she meant. Because for me, that's this. See, in this outrageous experiment that we call the church, that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years, in the face of persecution, in the face of difficulty, in the face of battling against all odds, what is it that brings us here every week? What are we finding here that we cannot do on our own? It's that I want to explore today, but before I do that, would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, your word says that unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing in your sight. And would you use your words, spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit, to do what only you can do, to build up this orchestra you call your bride. I ask these things for myself and for my family and for everybody here. Amen. So I'm going to be really, really honest with you right now. There were many times that I snuck out when I knew it wasn't Pastor Dave preaching. It's kind of ironic now, isn't it? I feel like God has a sense of humor. He has to. It's true. I can't deny it. And it would go something like this, and maybe I'm not alone here. Someone else would walk out, and I'd write a note to my husband, and I'd say, "Circle one, Maudie's or Jack Allen's." And he'd circle one, and I'd say, "You get kids. I'll get bag. Meet at car." Yeah, you've probably seen me running from my car. And I can't deny it. It was the season I was in. The truth is, I had 3 little kids. One of them was an infant. I just moved. I just changed my career. I was tired. And I loved this place, and I loved what it offered me, and I would come and I'd sit on the back row, and I'd let the music kind of wash over me, and there was a feeling here that I loved. It was quiet. There was something peaceful in it. But I had nothing to give. I had no bandwidth. And I'd try to duck out without making eye contact with anybody because I'm kind of an introvert, and I always thought it was a little awkward. And let's be honest, church people can be a little awkward. It can be a little annoying. And that was me. But I, at some point, changed my perspective. And Pastor Dave's asked me before, what is it that kind of pushed you off center? And I honestly don't really know. I know at one point he preached a sermon about asking us to listen to other voices. But I think what it really came down to is I just was so tired of nobody knowing my name. I wanted family here. I wanted at least one person to notice maybe if I didn't show up on Sunday. And so there was this moment where I decided I was just going to go all in with this thing. I was going to push past being an introvert, and I was going to push past every tendency I had to stay home and do what made sense and be comfortable and keep it easy, and I was just going to go for it. and I was going to embrace the awkward. And so I did, and it wasn't easy. I tried several community groups before I kind of got my right fit, and I ended up in a deeper journey class. But I made some friends, and what I found on the other side of that decision, on the other side of that, is what Paul wanted for the Ephesians. It's what Paul was praying for. When in Ephesians 3:17, he said, "For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith." In other words, what Paul's saying here is for this reason of being together, I'm praying, I'm asking that God, from whom you get your identity, that he would pour out on you your unique calling, your instrument, and that would make you strong in your inner man and give you that sense of purpose. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on. "And that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend." See, for Paul, learning your instrument, figuring out what your thing is, wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. It was where he started that prayer. He knew that if they could just press that, if they could just take that instrument and actually experience what it felt like to join that with the orchestra, that they would have an understanding that they wouldn't otherwise have. That's certainly been my experience here at Riverbend. This morning, I want to share with you 3 things that I've found on the other side of that choice. I share them with you not just to tell you my story, but because I genuinely believe that those are things you'll find too on the other side of your engagement here. The first one is I had my character developed. Ephesians 3:18 says, "And that you, being rooted and grounded in love, then may be able to comprehend with all the saints." That Greek word that's translated there as with, in some translations is together with, and it's seen. And it means accompanied by, in the same direction as, possessing or having, or indicating the instrument used to perform an action. It's open to interpretation whether Paul meant by adding with, whether he meant in the company of or by means of. But I'm going to suggest this morning that that ambiguity is purposeful, that it's actually both. That Paul knew that it's not just in the company of believers, but through being in the company of believers that we get something we wouldn't otherwise have. For me, for the homebody that I am, that with is where the rub is. Because I want to just podcast my sermons, and I want to just enjoy this on my time and from my living room. Being with people is hard. That's where the rub is. But guys, the rub, the friction, that's how an instrument gets played. That's how we develop character. Proverbs 27:17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another." See, I'd grown up in church and I'd read the Bible and I knew a lot of things with my head. And I kind of brought that attitude, I'm sad to say, but I brought that attitude to women's community group, just thinking, I don't know, I'm not sure what you have to tell me about this. These are things that I know. But what I met were so many incredible women from different ages and different stages of life with different perspectives other than my own. And it broke me out of my own echo chamber, and it gave me humility and empathy, and they taught me grace, and they taught me love, and they taught me what it actually is supposed to look like. The second thing I want to share with you that I've gained from this choice is that I've discovered my own value. See, in the days when I came and I sat on the back row and I just consumed church, I really didn't consider that anybody's voice other than Pastor Dave's had any value to me. I made that determination before I walked in the door, including whether or not my voice had any value. But here's the thing, when somebody's hurting, when somebody's here on a Sunday, just a body in the room, just somebody who's gonna hug them and love on them, just somebody who's gonna smile at them, every contribution, every person here has something to offer. Ephesians 3:18, it says, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but I understand that if I go to IKEA to buy a piece of furniture, they're only going to give me 3 dimensions, not 4. Because that's exactly what stuff is, right? Stuff is 3 dimensions. That's how we measure things. So when Paul is giving us a 4-fold formula like this, he's making a mistake that no educated Greek would have made. And this formula, written this way, doesn't show up anywhere else. It's not in Jewish tradition, it's not in the Hellenistic world, it's not in the classical writers, it's not in any contemporary manuscript from the time. The only other place it kind of sounds similar is Paul in Romans 8:39, where he writes, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God." See, I think Paul understood that this isn't really something we have adequate words for. There are things that are so real that we can't even see. Paul here isn't measuring a box. He's trying to put words to this transcendent mystery, this thing that is so hard to explain that you just have to kind of experience. My son, Mitchell, he's 4 years old, and every time I ask him, "How much do I love you?" he does jumping jacks. Yeah. And the reason for that is because his whole life, every time I tried to tell him how much I loved him, I'd say, "Buddy, it's this much, and this much, and this much, and this much." And so, jumping jacks. But because of that, I feel like I understand that Paul isn't measuring a box. He's doing jumping jacks for the church and saying it's this much, and this much, and this much, and this much. It's the height and it's the depth. And I understand that now on the other side of women's community group and Deeper Journey, because I've now had the opportunity to hug women and love on women who have found love on the other side of grief, who've finally gotten that job that they were looking for years, who finally conceived that child that they'd waited for. And I've cried with women while their marriage was falling apart, after they lost that child. This is the height, and this is the depth. The third thing that I have gained here in community is the experience of the love of Christ. Paul writes in verse 19, "And to know the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. What does Paul mean by that? How do you know something that surpasses knowledge? I think most of us kind of know that in our bones. We know that there are some things that you know that you don't know. When I was a little girl, I was a ballerina. I was just in love with the ballet. And every single Christmas, my ballet school would put on a production of The Nutcracker. And I had hours and hours of rehearsals. And so whenever it wasn't your dance, you would kind of sit on the side of the stage and you'd eat snacks and you'd play card games with your friends and you'd braid each other's hair and you'd wait for your number to come up. And for those of you who aren't super familiar with the story of the Nutcracker, there's this little girl named Clara, and she receives a nutcracker for Christmas, and then that night she has a terrible nightmare that she's being attacked by an army of mice. And the Nutcracker springs to her rescue. And along with a team of toy soldiers, they fight back the mice in this epic battle, and they win. And then the Nutcracker kind of transforms into this prince, and he whisks Clara away to his kingdom of sweets. It's a really pretty story. But there was one piece of music, and not every production interprets the music the same way. And I'm disappointed to tell you that most of them, I feel like, get this part wrong. But in our production of the Nutcracker, there was this one piece of music called Into the Pine Forest. And it was when the battle scene kind of fades away and this moonlit pine forest appears. And the snow is sort of lightly falling on the stage. And it's this dance between the Nutcracker prince and Clara. And as a little girl, this number was spectacular. I couldn't eat snacks and play cards. I was completely captured by this dance, by this music. It was music like I have never heard before. And it kind of starts really slow with this sort of bubbling harp. And then it builds and it builds, and then it kind of falls back again, and then it builds some more, and it seems like more instruments get added, and it gets a little bit louder, and there are these crescendos and peaks, and then it kind of falls back again. But every time it hit a peak, he'd lift her over his head, and her nightgown would sort of flutter in the breeze, and it was magic. And it was finally kind of coming to this giant crescendo with cymbals and drums and this incredible piece of music, and it just finishes on this large, grand note and then kind of fades back away. And I wanted to tell you about it because at the time I wanted to tell you that that was a moment, a really important moment in my life that was only made possible because of orchestra, because of all of those instruments coming together and doing their part and playing their piece. So I went to one of our resident musical experts, Ty Taylor. He studied music composition, and I thought he could give me the words I needed to tell you about this piece. And I learned all kinds of things. I learned a bunch I didn't know. I learned it was a waltz, it's played in threes. I learned that it has themes of tension and release. I learned terms I didn't know, like arpeggiate and tenuto and poco crescendo, which means a little bit or slowly louder. But as Ty pointed out to me that day, I didn't need to know any of that to know what Tchaikovsky wanted me to know. I didn't need to study musical composition. I didn't need to have the right terms. It was in my bones. I knew that it was a romance. I knew the story he was telling. I knew it without knowing it. Javier Chaparro's story didn't end with the fire. He was actually part of a community that knew about his loss and heard about his loss, and they all came together to try to get him a voice. He shared before, here at Riverbend, how he acquired a Guarneri violin For those of you who don't know, Guarneri was a contemporary of Stradivari. They both worked in Cremona, Italy, and both makers' violins are prized equally beloved in the violin world. It's an incredibly special violin made in 1670. It has deep, rich voice. And it was gifted to him along with this Christmas card that said, as much as this violin needs you, you need this violin. It was a gift. But that wasn't the only violin that Javier was gifted. He had another friend that he'd gone to see about some other violin, and while he was there trying to work out that exchange, the friend said, "Hey, before you go, would you just play one more violin? It hasn't been played in 20 years, but it would mean a lot to me if you'd play it before you go. Just try it." And out of the back, he brought a violin that was museum quality, made by one of the best French makers, Jean-Baptiste Vuillaume. It was made from one solid piece of flame maple wood. It had masterful inlays, it had intricate carvings. It was beautiful. And Javier started to play this violin, and his friend started to cry. And he said, "This was my mother's violin. I haven't heard that sound, I haven't heard that voice since she died." See, for the friend, it was priceless. So he insisted that Javier take the violin. He said, "I can't put a value on this. You have to take it. It's a gift." Because he wasn't measuring the value of an instrument. He was experiencing that transcendent, extra dimension that Paul talks about. He was experiencing his mother. But in a way, so is Javier, because Javier will tell you that when he plays an instrument, it actually heats up from the heat of his body playing it and from the friction of it being played. And as it heats up, its organic wood grains release their oils and the aroma, and he can actually smell the people who have played it in the past. He says, it's as if we're all singing together. It's stories like this. It's stories like this that remind us of the eternal story. The one that spans thousands and thousands of years. The one that says over us, you belong. You are loved. You have value just by being here. And if you'll come, and if you'll engage, and if you'll participate, you'll have your character developed. You'll figure out your value in this place, your purpose, your meaning. But you'll also experience the love of Christ like you just can't do on your own. Because this is his body. This is the incarnation. These are his hands, and these are his feet. I believe that this is the knowing beyond knowing. This is the being filled up to all the fullness of God. This is what Paul prayed for the Ephesians and what he prays for us. Last week, you got to hear a song written specifically for this sermon series by my dear friend Travis Taylor. And you heard it performed by the incredibly talented Maddie Schulte, and you heard her accompanied by a single piano. Today, right now, I want you to listen to it again. This time there will be some additional voices. There'll be some more instruments. And I believe you'll hear a fullness. you'll hear the richness that their showing up brings to you. And all we had to have to make that happen was for them to join.
A symphony of you is softly singing a different part